Hello, everyone. I'm Miss Olivia from the Durham County Library, where I work as an assistant in the children's unit. I'm here to tell you about a very noteworthy book entitled Meet Addy, written by Connie Porter. You may have seen this book either in the library or on a bookshelf somewhere. It was first published by the Pleasant Company, the folks who brought you the American Girl Dolls collection. This was the first book in a series about Addy. She lived with her family on a huge plantation near Durham, North Carolina, which, by the way, is where I am. Being a historical fiction book, the names of people and places have been changed, but the situations and the experiences of people could very well have happened. The year is 1864, a most dreadful time in the history of the United States, because the states are not united. There is a civil war going on, which could end up in the separation of the states and the creation of two new countries. The Union States would make one country, and the Confederate States would make up another country. The story begins one night when Addy wakes up hearing the soft voices of her mama and her papa. Usually she's reassured by their whispering, but tonight she hears the worriedness in their voices as they talk about how they might take their freedom. You see, the real Addy and at least 1,000 other people were enslaved on one of the largest plantations in North Carolina. Addy was not allowed to do as she pleased, nor were her parents. They were the property of rich white people. Addy and the other enslaved humans around her had to work for no pay. And she really didn't have time for herself. When she wasn't out in the fields taking water or having to pull live worms off of the cotton plants, she was usually up at the big kitchen helping her Auntie Lula prepare the meals for the folks that lived in the big house with the fancy dining room. Yeah. So one day she has gone to the big house to serve the meal, the luncheon meal. And she's the first person to find out that her papa and her brother are about to be sold. Her life is changed at the very moment she hears this news. And no matter how much she begs the master of the plantation to let her father and her brother stay with her, no matter how much she clings to her papa, she is separated from them. And other separations are in store for Addy and her family. Throughout it all, Addy has to face fearful situations that no child, let alone any adult, should ever have to face. she learns about the power of love and how it can overcome the power of hate. She learns the core meaning of freedom. She learns to hope for a better future. All of these experiences make Addy a very grown-up 9-year-old. She's smart, and like I said, she's hopeful. Her family has surrounded her in that strong love. It's what has given her a taste of true freedom, because that love that she receives has been given freely. She remembers it, and it helps her get through she remembers it when she's going through good times, and of course, when she's going through bad times, she remembers that love. She remembers when she faces and feels discrimination. And she realizes that she has heroes around her. Her mom even reminds her of one when Addy is given a cowrie shell. This cowrie shell has come all the way from West Africa around the neck of her great-grandmother. It's a cowrie shell necklace, and it's very significant and has a lot of power. It has healing, and it has strength. It has humility and respect, and Addy puts it on and realizes she can remember her own great-grandmother with her. Now, as they travel through the night, Addy and her mama obviously look up at the sky, and they look for the Big Dipper. Can you see the Big Dipper? At one end of the Big Dipper is the North Star, called Polaris. It points them in the direction of north, which is where freedom is. You know, the shape of those stars look like a dipper, and they kind of look like a drinking gourd, which is a ginormous squash that has been dried out and scooped out and carved to look something like, where is it? To look like a giant spoon that you can dip into the water and drink from. That's why they called the song Follow the Drinking Gourd. And even though Addy had to be very quiet while she and her mama were escaping, she probably thought of a lot of the spirituals that she learned to sing back on the plantation. And one of them, I bet she thought about, was wade in the water. But you know, they were not able to wade in this water. Ooh, they almost lost each other. Addy and her mama were using the underground railroad system to try and get to freedom. Here's North Carolina, and they're right in the middle, and they're taking a middle route. They're headed for Philadelphia. I wonder if they get there. You'll have to read the book to find out. And I recently had the pleasure to talk with Connie Porter, the author of Meet Addy. When the executives of the Pleasant Company approached Miss Porter to write a story about their newest American doll that they were making, she was told that Addy was going to be the first African-American doll in the series. And of course, she needed her own book and book series. So Miss Porter signed up to be the author. Addy came with her own executive board made up of 7 historians and experts about African American history. Isn't she gorgeous? Addy is wearing a different bonnet today than the one that she first came with. And I think she is wearing the most beautiful dress, don't you? Do you think she got to wear this when she lived on the plantation? You'll have to read the book to find out. The decision to place Addy, her story, in the Civil War period was deliberate. All other periods of time and about the history of African Americans in this country lead back to the institution of enslavement of Black people. I asked Miss Porter if she had a message to all of you who might be reading Meet Addy for the first, second, maybe third time. And she answered, I want you to learn about the resilience that Addy has. Slave is not the only word to describe her. Words like daughter, sister, friend, person with purpose also describe her. And then she went on to say, characters like Addy are integral to our country. She's a face and a connection to the past. Perhaps the time that our country is in right now can give us opportunities to reflect on our similarities and rather than differences between each other. And let me just end with saying, meet Addy, and you just might meet a part of yourself. Thank you for coming, and please join us immediately following, stay tuned, for a virtual tour of Stagville Historic Site. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's a-gonna trouble the water. God's a-gonna trouble the water. Bye.
Hi everyone, welcome to Historic Stagville. My name is Vera Sosowski and I'm the site manager here at Historic Stagville. and I'll be leading your video tour this morning. Historic Stackville is a state historic site right here in Durham, North Carolina. You can come to visit our site and see land and historic buildings that tie back to the history of families like Addy's family and her story. Historic Stackville was one of the largest plantations anywhere in North Carolina. In 1865, there were probably close to 1,000 men, women, and children who were forced to live in slavery on this site. This plantation covered about 50 square miles of land around what is now the city of Durham. During this video, we're going to visit a few of the places and see a few of the things here at Historic Stagville that were part of the inspiration for the Addy books in the American Girl series. We're going to talk about the Walker family, a real family from Historic Stagville whose journey to freedom inspired Addy's story. And we're also going to see a few of the things that were made or used by enslaved families here at Stagville that help us understand some of the inspiration for Addy and her family and some of the things that they see and experience in those books. During this tour, we're also going to be able to visit a few of the original slave dwellings that are still standing here at Historic Stagville, and we're going to step into some of the spaces where enslaved families like Addy's family actually lived in the 1850s and 1860s. This is one of the very special sites that we have here at Historic Stagville. These rocks that you can see behind me here are actually the ruins of where there used to be a house for an enslaved family. These ruins were uncovered here by archaeologists that were working here at Stagville, and they dug down in the ground and they uncovered these rocks, which mark the site of a house where a family was living here in slavery. This might have been a house like one of the houses where Addy and her family lived in their story when they were still held in slavery on the plantation. We can learn a lot about the families who were here at Stagville during slavery by finding things that were left here around their houses or in their yards over 150 years ago when they were living here during slavery. And this site, these stones behind me, are one of the places where one of the most important things that has ever been found here was found. The archaeologists that dug down at this site found a tiny seashell buried underneath this house. This shell is very small, it's only about this big, so it might not seem very important. But actually, this shell tells us a huge amount about the family that was living here. The tiny shell that was found here is called a cowrie shell. And cowrie shells were very important to people all across Western Africa. They were used by people in many different places, in many different cultures, for many different things. These tiny seashells were a very important part of people's culture and traditions in Western Africa. So finding this shell here, all the way across the world, here in North Carolina, tells us that a family that was living in slavery at this site may have passed down this shell from person to person as they were captured, forced into slavery, brought to the United States, brought here to North Carolina, and they may have been holding on to that shell, keeping it safe and strong with them, even while they were being forced to endure slavery here at Stagville. In Addy's story, she has a cowrie shell just like this one that was passed to her in her family. In Addy's story, she learns that this shell is a reminder of who her ancestors were in West Africa and of the strong love and power in her family that was passed down through the generations as they survived slavery. I wonder if the family who lived in this house had stories like that that went with their shell. One of the most important connections between Addy's story and this place here at Stagville is the history of a real family who were held in slavery here at Stagville. That family, the Walker family, shares the same name as Addy Walker and her family. The mother of the Walker family was a woman named Mary Walker, who was born on this plantation into slavery in 1818. Mary Walker is very special here in the history of this place because she's one of the only people we know of who was ever able to successfully escape from slavery and take her freedom away from this place. When she was a young girl here, Mary was forced to work as a servant and a maid for the women in the white family who owned this plantation. She had very little private space or time of her own. She was surrounded by dangers, and she was able to spend probably very little time with her own family because of the work she was forced to do. When Mary was a young woman, she had 3 children that were born here at Stagville. Her oldest son, Frank, her middle daughter, Aggie, who might have been the inspiration for Addy's name, and her young son, Bryant. While her children were growing up here, Mary was forced to work as a nurse for the women in the Cameron family, as many of them became very sick. Mary was required to take care of them while they were sick, day in and day out, in the middle of the night and early in the morning. And because of this, she was forced to travel everywhere that this family traveled. She didn't just stay here on this plantation. When they went hundreds of miles away into Virginia or down to Florida, or even just over to the city of Raleigh, Mary was forced to go with them. And sometimes that meant leaving behind her mother, her grandmother, and her children who were still held in slavery here at Stackville, away from her. When Mary Walker was about 30 years old, the family who owned this plantation began to make a series of trips all the way up to the city of Philadelphia. And they ordered Mary to come along with them on these trips to keep working as a maid and a nurse. Because she was enslaved, Mary Walker had no ability to say no. It would have been too dangerous for her or her family to refuse or protest going along on these trips. So Mary was forced to leave behind her beloved children who were here at Stagville in North Carolina, and she was forced to leave them on these long trips up to Philadelphia. However, there was something kind of remarkable about these trips to Philadelphia. Philadelphia was in a free state at the time, which means that someone like Mary Walker, who was enslaved, could have the opportunity to try to take their freedom in a place like Philadelphia. The first year that Mary Walker went to Philadelphia with the family who owned this plantation, she made contact with activists, people who were fighting against slavery in Philadelphia, people who wanted to help her get free. But Mary knew that the people that she loved were still in slavery here in North Carolina, and so she made the choice to return here to them rather than trying to escape and risking leaving them behind. Year after year, she went back to Philadelphia. Year after year, she returned to North Carolina to stay connected to the people who she loved who were here. But in the summer of 1848, Mary Walker was in Philadelphia yet again. While she was there, she learned that the family who enslaved her, the family who owned this plantation, were probably planning to sell or separate her family. She realized that no matter what she did, her family were going to be broken and taken away from her. And with that horrible threat over her head, she decided that she had to try to take her freedom and get herself to freedom while she was still in Philadelphia. So while she was there, Mary Walker turned to that network of activists and freedom fighters that were in Philadelphia, and those people helped her hide, helped keep her safe, and ultimately helped her escape to freedom and away from the family who had held her in slavery here. Mary was able to live in freedom for many years as a free person, but throughout all of her life in freedom, she thought relentlessly about her children, about Frank and Aggie and Bryant, who were still here in slavery. She tried everything she could think of to get them free, sending secret messages to them, hiring secret agents to come down into North Carolina and try to bring them away to her. She even tried to offer the family who owned this plantation money in order to buy their freedom. But none of these tactics ever succeeded, and so Mary Walker was forced to live separated from her family who were growing up here in North Carolina without their mother. Eventually, when the American Civil War started and ended, Mary was able to send a message down into North Carolina, because when the American Civil War ended, slavery also ended here in North Carolina. For the first time, after all these years apart, she was able to look for and try to find her beloved children. In the summer of 1865, Mary found Aggie, her daughter, and Bryant, her youngest son, still here in North Carolina after the end of slavery. And the two of them were able to travel up and live with her again for the rest of their lives. Before they saw each other again that summer, this family had been separated apart from each other for over 17 years. Mary Walker's story, Aggie, and Bryant, and Frank Walker's story is a story of a real family here from North Carolina who tried to escape from slavery and dealt with the real risks and choices and dangers of challenging the system of slavery to get free. You'll have to read Addy's book to see how much of her story was inspired by the Walkers and see the ways that her journey to freedom was similar and different from what Mary and Frank and Walker and Bryant Walker experienced here in North Carolina. These buildings behind me are some of the most important buildings that we protect here at Historic Stackville. These buildings are original slave dwellings from the Stagville Plantations. This house, which was built in the 1850s, was a home where 4 enslaved families were forced to live during their time in slavery here. In just a minute, we're going to go inside and see one of the rooms in this house and see a room like where Addy and her family might have lived during their story. Now we're here inside the slave dwelling here at Horton Grove. This one room where I'm standing would have been the home for an entire family that was living in slavery here on this plantation. This one room would have been where they slept, where they ate, where they prepared food, and it may have even been a place where they were forced to work at times. The things that you'll see in this room aren't quite as old as the building that we're in right now, but they're here to give you an idea of what this room might have looked like when an African American family was living here in slavery in the 1850s. This room might look a little bit like the house or the room where Addy and her family lived in her story. This cloth doll that I'm holding here in this basket is one of the only things that survives here at Stackville that might have actually been made or used by a family that was living here during slavery. That makes this doll a very precious part of the history of this place. In Addy's story, she has a cloth doll that her mother made for her, and she leaves it behind with her baby sister when they began her journey to freedom. This doll might have been the inspiration for that kind of cloth doll. You can see, if you look closely at this doll, that it is made of a rough cloth. The stuffing inside the doll is little pieces of cotton lint in different colors. And if you look very closely, you can see that some of the stitches on the doll are a little bit uneven. I wonder if this doll was made by someone young who was still learning to sew, or maybe practicing to sew. This doll doesn't have a lot of color or decoration on it, but it does have a little piece of red ribbon tied around its neck, and it does have a little bit of precious red thread that someone used to make the face of this doll. This doll might have been made and played with by one of the children that was living here in this house.